Hello, and welcome to Physical Attraction. This episode we have an exciting guest to talk to. Professor Rebecca Willis is a professor in practice at Lancaster University, where she is working intensely on climate policy and climate politics, and how politicians respond to the issue of climate change. She was involved in organising the Climate Assembly UK, which we covered in some of the earlier episodes, and has written a wonderful book, Too Hot to Handle, The Democratic Challenge of Climate Change, about the democratic challenges of climate change, based on intensive research and discussion with politicians here in the UK and elsewhere. And it covers some of the framings of climate change that we consider, the barriers to political engagement and action, and it has an excellent action plan at the end of it, explaining how to construct good climate policy. And whether you're involved in that or whether you're just a climate activist or someone who's concerned about this, that is a blueprint of what to ask for and what to push for. So it's all the better that we have it. Now, we had a very wide-ranging discussion, and Professor Willis was very generous with her time, and we thank her for that. Without further ado then, the interview. Okay, so first off, Professor Willis, I want to thank you very much for coming on the show. I always like to lead off by asking my guests to introduce themselves a little bit and to talk about how they got to where they are now. So would you like to talk a little bit about how you got involved in climate politics and policy?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Becky Willis. I'm a professor in practice at Lancaster University. And where does this all begin? Depending on how you measure it. My interest in climate politics actually started from my undergraduate degree when I had to answer an essay about why climate change was a harder problem to solve than ozone depletion. So that was getting on for 30 years ago, and I've sort of been answering that essay ever since. But I was always into the politics, and that's how I spent sort of the first 20 years of my career working with and around government, trying to get better decision making around energy and climate and environment issues. And then I sort of took a sidestep a few years ago and went back into the university sector, and that was partly because I'd done a lot of work with MPs, sort of providing training and support on climate, and I just became very, borderline obsessed with the question of what do they do with the knowledge that they have. If you teach them, and if you teach them what they need to know about climate, and then they sort of shut the door of the training room and walk back into the rest of their lives, what can they do with that knowledge? How can they operationalize it? Why do they and why don't they? And that became the subject of my academic research.
And I think this is really interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned the Montreal, the ozone layer issue, because we did an episode that long-time listeners will remember 2 or 3 years ago about lessons from Montreal and how the world had managed to come to a Montreal protocol which was very rigid, very technocratic, where they said we're going to phase out the CFCs. Everyone signed up to it, and that worked quite well, and now the ozone layer is essentially healing itself. But we talked about some of the comparisons and contrasts between that and international climate change negotiations, and how fossil fuels were much more embedded into society, I suppose, and how there were much more inequities in how they were used, and how it's been so difficult for international democratic institutions to deal with a system where there are so many different players compared to the CFC's case. And so part of why we are talking about is your book, Too Hot to Handle, The Democratic Challenge of Climate Change, which I have here. It's an excellent book if anyone wants to pick it up. But just on that subtitle, do you think that climate change does pose a unique challenge for democratic institutions? And can we talk about some of the reasons why this is the case as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult thing for democracies to do. So, it's long term. I mean, of course, as you know, the effects are with us now, and it's urgent, and yet it's also long term in that it plays out over years and decades, not days and weeks and months. So it's long term. It is global and systemic, whereas our democracies are national or regional or local. It requires people to think as in quite a complex way as citizens. It requires them to sort of have the collective interest in their mind. So it asks quite a lot of citizens, the climate agenda, at a time when politicians are maybe reluctant to make that ask of them. So there are all kinds of ways in which climate change is a challenge for democracies. But I think the critical thing here is that you can have two responses to that. You can say, climate change is just too difficult for democracy, so we'll have to find an undemocratic route. And that's, something that James Lovelock, for example, the earth scientist, suggested when he said we might need to put democracy on hold for a while. Or you take a deep breath and you say, okay, democracies as they're currently constituted don't work very well for climate. Is the solution actually making democracies work better? And is that not only I would argue that that's, obviously morally and ethically a better option, but actually I think it's more realistic as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting. Just on this long-termism, short-termism issue, I think we can all get the sense of, okay, emissions need to be cut over the course of probably decades, and the direct benefits of doing that won't be realised for some decades, when politicians are often thinking about the next election, which is only ever 4 or 5 years away, unless, of course, you're talking about something like the House of Lords, where they don't have that sort of thing to worry about. We talk a lot on this show when we talk about catastrophic risks and things of that nature, how important it is to have more long-term thinking. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on, I know it's difficult, but if you had any thoughts on how we could encourage that.
You mentioned the House of Lords, and the way that other countries have addressed this problem is to set up specific mechanisms or institutions which are actually charged with considering the future. So they've experimented with this in Hungary and Finland, but actually probably the best existing experiment now is in Wales. So Wales have a Commissioner for Future Generations. They have a Future Generations Act, and the public sector is required to take future generations into account in all of their work. So there's some actually pretty worked through sort of institutionalized examples in Wales of how you can bear the future in mind when you're legislating. So that's really useful and positive, I think. But I actually think that that there are a lot of ways of bringing climate change into day-to-day politics as well. So you can do it that way around. So if you look actually at what Joe Biden in his first literally few days is doing, he's straight out of the blocks on climate, and he's linking it to jobs and regeneration from economic regeneration after COVID. So what he's effectively doing there is finding ways of sort of operationalizing a longer term problem and making it into a shorter term opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting too when we're talking about this flurry of executive orders that he issued in the first week, even yesterday, I think it was, about climate change. And one of the focuses there was on justice as well. And it's this integration of climate with other issues, social issues that in some ways seem even more pressing and more short term. And of course, as I'm sure we would agree and can talk about, these things are all linked together and integrated together. And solving this long-term problem does require immediate and short-term actions, which can have some co-benefits as well. But yeah, I think it's interesting, this idea of whether you have to integrate climate into other issues or whether you can deal with it as its own issue. And even in the structures of government, this is something we've seen, like, should the UK have its own climate change department, or is it okay for it to be folded into different departments?
I mean, there's two ways of looking at that, aren't there? There's the processes and structures of government, and climate absolutely needs to be integrated. But I think there's a really interesting question about the politics of this. So, the reason that Biden is doing what he's doing is because the left in the US have spent the last few years, when they haven't had their heads in their hands, they've spent the last few years organising and thinking and advocating. And what they have done is tie climate action very firmly to a set of sort of progressive left issues around social justice, racial justice, economic regeneration, and so on. That is the essence of the Green New Deal, isn't it? That's,
Yeah.
very deliberate language there around a New Deal and so on. And they've done that really effectively. I sometimes worry that maybe it's sort of almost too effective in that it has sort of made climate into a part of that left-wing agenda, which is great if that's your politics. But what I haven't seen on either side of the Atlantic, really, maybe we're fumbling towards it here, but I haven't seen it with any confidence. I haven't seen it articulated with any confidence. It's a sort of right-wing articulation of what climate politics looks like. So, although Boris Johnson in this country has repeatedly stressed his support for the net zero strategy, although there are some, the words you might expect around technology and innovation and opportunity and so on, they haven't actually done the hard graft of thinking through how their climate strategy fits with their aspirations as a party, or the aspirations of 50% of the population roughly who tend to vote right wing rather than left wing. So I think that's a job that really, really needs doing, and that has been done effectively on the left but not yet on the right.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And in the US, there are some quite considerable challenges and barriers to getting that working. But you've studied in great deal how UK politicians, specifically and MPs, react to climate change, how they speak about it, both in Parliament and to environmental activists, and through interviews that you've personally had with them as well. And I think a key part of this is, the discussion that we can have on climate change quite often is academic, technocratic. It's climate experts, it's policy wonks talking to each other. We're both on climate Twitter a bit, and we sort of are familiar with that sphere of things. And lots of these discussions are things that I bring to my listeners with this show as well. But actually understanding how that's translated to people for whom this isn't their whole milieu and surroundings, I guess, how the politicians think about climate change, I think is really interesting. So I'd love to know what you took away from some of these case studies and discussions, how they think of the issue and what their priorities are, and things that surprised or didn't surprise you about how they responded in these conversations.
Yeah, so it was a really fascinating set of interviews. I mean, I'd worked with politicians for years. I used to work for politicians. It was one of my first jobs. So I knew the world well. But when I actually got them sort of sat down with a coffee for an anonymous interview, it was really revealing. So I think on the science, did they understand climate change? I mean, I think broadly, they do understand it. Maybe they're not as worried about it as they should be. Maybe it doesn't sort of get them in the gut the way it does if you spend a long time sitting with climate science. If you're on climate Twitter, you think about it all the time. The enormity of the science sort of sits with you quite strongly, doesn't it? And I don't think they're there, but they do understand the nature of the threat. The problems come in terms of the, what do we do about it question. And I was struck really by how difficult the MPs found it to think about how they would sort of operationalise climate change. And, there were sort of three reasons for that. One is just that the day job is like completely overwhelming. And I'm not saying this to make excuses for them. I'm just explaining. It's like you just get stuff thrown at you the whole time. And a lot of the MPs were quite confessional in these interviews. They were saying, look, I'm really struggling to find a time to be able to sort of, to sit back and think, what am I in this for? What am I going to actually champion? So that from that point of view, it's not just climate, but climate is a difficult one to champion for all the reasons that we started with. It's complex and so on. So firstly, it's just sort of overwhelm is an issue. The second, which is possibly the most fascinating finding as far as I'm concerned, is that they were worried that they would be seen as that they would be sort of marginalised if they spoke out on climate, that they didn't want to be branded as freaks or zealots. Those were their words, not mine. That they wanted to be seen as sort of respectable politicians, and that if they were too strident on climate change, that might count against them. And the last thing that came across pretty strongly was that they didn't think that there was public support for action. Now, this was actually, I finished those a couple of years ago, so I think that's changed a bit since. But the sort of broad summary on that is that politicians politicians consistently underestimate the levels of public support for climate action.
When you talk about politicians not knowing how to operationalise climate change, one thing you didn't mention so much was almost the lack of information problem. Is it the case that they broadly know which areas of their remit actually do link to climate change and the implications of that? Or are there still areas where there's information that needs to get to them?
I mean, I find this, sociologists might call it the information deficit model, this idea that if only we got them enough information, they'd be able to make decent decisions. That just isn't how politicians work. In fact, it isn't how people work. The fact is that if they, people have to be motivated to get information. And so we shouldn't think of it as a lack of fact sheets. We should think of it as
I guess they're not hard to come by, are they?
No. I mean, you can. It doesn't for someone intelligent enough to be elected to Parliament. It's not hard to get to the truth of even really tricky issues like, bioenergy. It's all there, but you got to invest. So, I mean, leaving aside the problems with that information deficit model, what I would say, actually, no, this is linked. What I would say is that politicians have been able to get away with not knowing a huge amount because there isn't nearly the same sort of scrutiny or media attention. So I've seen this, for example, with the coal mine that's proposed near me in Cumbria. And there are some sort of zombie arguments about this coal mine that keep coming back, like, oh, we need the coal for steel production. Well, actually, we don't if you dig into it. But it's very easy for people, and especially politicians, to fall back on these sort of assumptions and not really challenge them. And we don't have that level of interrogation in terms of media or even in select committees and so on that we might have on other issues.
It's the case that climate change is sometimes seen as a complex scientific and technological issue where technocrats and experts should largely be in control. This extends even to some of the scientific and technical language that politicians use when they discuss it. And of course, a lot of the ways that the discourse is shaped by the people who are the scientists and the technicians and so on. But your book persuasively makes the case that if we try and leave this solely to the experts and they come up with a solution that they then try to impose from the top down, as if the whole world was one of these delightful integrated assessment economic models, then we will fail in our objectives. And I'm sure that people listening will understand that this is the case. But would you like to expand on that? And I suppose some of the shortcomings to some of the approaches that we've had for dealing with climate change so far?
Up until now, to the extent that we've had some success with decarbonisation, we have succeeded in the more sort of technical spheres. So, we've done reasonably well we've done very well in terms of integration of renewable electricity onto the grid, even though, as you know, most of the energy used by human societies is still from fossil fuels. But even so, we've done quite well with renewables. We've done okay with efficiency, in car engines, efficiency in industry, and so on. And all those things can be done sort of without people noticing, more or less. But if you look at the challenges ahead, you look at decarbonisation of home heating and cooling, you look at the decarbonisation of transport, which almost certainly requires, obviously a shift to EVs, but also changing travel patterns. You look at the changes needed to diet and to land use. There's absolutely no way that you could do that without people noticing. And why even try? Instead, why not actually this is the idea really behind something like the Climate Assembly, which I know you've talked about before. Rather than sort of pretending that it can all be tidied up and solved without people noticing, why not actually take that dilemma to people and ask people as citizens, not as consumers, ask them what they think about, how we should decarbonise transport. What are the options? How would they, affect people's everyday lives in, some positive, maybe some negative ways, and actually ask them to be part of defining a strategy that we can all buy into. I mean, that's the point of, that's the point of government, isn't it? To develop that sort of social contract between citizen and state, so that we sort of, if you go back to the very basics of political philosophy, the whole idea is that we as citizens agree to surrender a certain amount of liberty to the state. In return, the state does things collectively for us that we can't do on our own. And, protecting us from dangerous climate change is surely, a number one requirement of a state. So, sorry, that was a sort of little foray into political philosophy there. But the whole point is that we should be very explicit about that social contract. We should say to people, look, we're treating you like grown-ups. We absolutely know that we need to make these cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. There's different ways of doing this. We want to talk to you about how to do that. We want this to be a collective problem that we're all solving.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And just to talk a little bit more about those different sectors, I'm sure I'm not alone in this. The Committee on Climate Change here in the UK has talked about this. There's a concern that we might be doing the easy bit of decarbonisation first and most effectively when it comes to making changes in the electricity sector. And this difficult bit, which is the transport, the agriculture, all of these other sectors, where you have many more actors, many more players, the heating of homes and businesses and so on, that you have to deal with. And you can't do quite so much from a sort of centralised top-down approach. That's where we're getting to now in the UK. And I feel like the UK is a good place to be because we have an opportunity to almost be trailblazers in that kind of decarbonisation in ways that, some other countries are still a little bit further behind in the power sector and so on. One thing that I think is really important when you talk about the social contract is when people don't know what the social contract is, or they don't have the terms of it explained to them and even negotiated with them, of course, then that's when you get this disenchantment. That's when you get people not being engaged and not feeling like they're participating in anything that's going on. And it becomes so much harder to collectively direct our efforts towards anything. So I think it's so important. And we know, as we've said, that addressing climate change is going to require this collective action. And that requires democratic legitimacy. Even in authoritarian countries where you might imagine politicians can just impose goals from the top down, there still needs to be some consent from the citizenry or powerful people and interests there. And establishing that is important, and talking outside of the bubble is important for that reason. So let's talk about the Citizens' Assembly on climate change then, because we did a couple of episodes on the show describing what citizens' assemblies are, and then the conclusions of the report from the Citizens' Assembly. For those who haven't listened, we did about an hour on that. But you were very involved in actually conducting it. So would you like to tell me, first off, what you see the roles of these deliberative bodies as being, and then we could talk about the experience of getting involved with it?
Yeah, well, you were just saying, you were just saying about whether we understand about that social contract that's there. And I mean, the way that you can think of something like a citizens' assembly is as a kind of mini manifestation of what a well-functioning democratic system should be doing. So there's a school of thought around deliberative democracy, which is where you strive for a democratic system which allows people to really think about how they form their views, gives people access to good information, tries to reduce the influence of power or the undue influence of power and money, and really privileges that sort of decision-making process that citizens, ideally would do in terms of their role in democracy. Getting the entire democratic system to work like that is a big ask. And so what you can do through things like citizens' assemblies, which are sometimes called deliberative mini-publics, is that you can create literally a mini-public, which, because you control that space, you can actually get it to mirror those sort of ideals of deliberation and democracy as much as possible. So that's really what what things like the Climate Assembly aim for, to have a really structured discussion in which people can participate in on equal terms, hear really good information, think it through and decide collectively what to do.
So would you like to talk a little bit about what your involvement with the Citizens' Assembly was like, what went well and worked well, and maybe improvements for the future?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's quite bizarre to reflect back, actually, because I would say 2 years ago, there was a few of us who were sort of desperately trying to think about how we could get a citizens' assembly up and running on climate change anywhere, anyhow. We'd seen the experiments in Ireland, and we were so excited by the idea of it that we were sort of trying to look for the money and the interest and everything, and then suddenly it just exploded. There was, partly, as a result of our work, and I think we just sort of managed to surf the mood because we just before the National Assembly, there was a few local initiatives set up, including a citizens' jury in Leeds, which I was involved with, and that was the first time I actually planned out how the process might be, and then I formed part of Involve's team to deliver the big climate assembly for Parliament, and it was so interesting to sort of start from the beginning about how you would structure a discussion about climate change with 108 people from all walks of life who might not be that informed about climate, might not be that concerned about climate, how you would structure the discussion, what experts they would hear from, how you would tackle tricky issues which might be divisive, and so on. So we had a good few planning sessions to think all that out, and then the kind of amazing moment was when I walked in that room in that hotel in Birmingham. So this is just before COVID. We were lucky to start off before COVID hit. We started in January, so about a year ago, January 2020, and I walked into that hotel room in Birmingham and literally saw my country set out before me, represented by these 108 people, and I just thought, they are here for 4 weekends, or as we thought 4, turned out to be 3 plus the online stuff, but they are here, they've given up 4 weekends to help us try and crack what is possibly the trickiest issue for politics, and that was an amazing moment, really.
I'm sure for you as a researcher into this, it's a pretty unique opportunity to do field work, So in the discussions with people, what kind of stood out to you about their concerns and their priorities that they had when dealing with climate change? Did you?
Well, I think what I learned was that if you give people a job to do and you give them the time and space and the respect, they'll take that responsibility really seriously. And it was amazing to see people, sitting around tables with people who were very different to them, who might, came from opposite ends of the country, who might have very different political views, how valuable it is actually to go through a process like that, to be part of it, how people's thoughts and attitudes change and shift through that process of deliberation. And you definitely find that in the research as well. If you track people as they go through a process like this, you definitely find that opinions shift and change. And that's a good thing because, that's what, as I say, ideally, that's what we should be doing in our democracy more widely.
Yeah, I think that's what I really liked about it. This is going to sound like a really silly comparison, so I have to apologise, but I've been listening to loads of shows and an audiobook about the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution, this all got started because they called up the Estates General, which was like their parliament, to try and solve the financial state that the kingdom was in. And then you actually had a sort of deliberative democracy at the start. It hadn't been formed into parties yet. everyone came with their own opinion, and they came there specifically with a task in mind, which was to solve a problem. How do we solve the problem of, well, in their case, it was like the Ancien regime that France was in. But in this case, the people are kind of directed to solve, okay, well, we have a policy of getting to net zero by 2050. And the sort of direction there is, well, how do you solve it? And so it's inherently constructive. It's not an argument, because you're involving people in how best to approach trying to solve a problem. And I think that is such a long way from the sort of rancor that often characterizes politics for a lot of people, and I think turns a lot of people off politics. And I just thought that was an aspect of it that was really interesting. I wonder if you felt the same way about it.
Yeah, I mean, you show me up now, because my lack of knowledge of the French Revolution. I thought you'd show me up for my for having given up physics pre GCSE. I have to say, I thought that was going to be my weak point, but it turns out to be French history. But I mean, leaving that aside, yeah, I think I mean, from how you describe it, I think that's really a good example of what happens when you give people a problem to solve. And something that I've been talking about with some researchers I've been working with is how you can actually, how these opportunities actually arise without necessarily you having to create a formal setup like the Climate Assembly. So Nicole Curato, who's an academic who works in Australia, but she looks at how communities in the Philippines responded to Typhoon Haiyan. And she says that if you look at the way that communities came together to respond and adapt to what had happened, it was actually a very sort of inclusive, deliberative process. And it didn't have any of the trappings of Climate Assembly UK in terms of, formal structure or facilitation or, aims and objectives or anything. But it was actually, they found a way of including people from all sorts of different backgrounds who could express their views on how the country should respond collectively. So I think it's really interesting to think about how we cultivate those, cultivate that approach more generally. And as you say, that is light years away from the sort of day-to-day of modern politics. And I mean, there's a really interesting political thinker called Deborah Mattinson who has who's described this the way that the electorate in the UK, at least, has been infantilized. She says that people are talked to like children. For example, this idea that we can have brilliant public services and not pay much tax. It's just not credible. And she says that if people are told these things, which are obviously not true, then they actually turn away from politics. So again, it's a case of in that case, it would be, okay, you want a really well-funded NHS or social care or whatever. Let's look at the options. Let's work out together how you're prepared to pay for it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a huge part of the problem with climate change as well is that for a lot of people, there is this sort of Ostrich Syndrome. It's so big that the actions that you can take in terms of, I don't know, turning off a light or changing the car or something seem so small in comparison to it. And it can seem like such an overwhelming problem. I think you just get a sort of Ostrich Syndrome and people just want to, stick their head in the sand and say, well, someone else will come along and sort it out, or, we'll invent our way out of it, or alternatively, just don't think about it and hope it goes away type problem, because there's a lack of roots to constructive engagement, I guess. And I think when you actually have these discussions about different ways that it impacts people and kind of involve them in that, I think it's just so much more constructive than the sort of approaches of, I don't know, either scaring people or talking down to them about it. The Climate Assembly has come up with its report and that's been submitted now. I wondered if there are plans to sort of continue with its work or kind of follow up on what it's done and what's happening there.
Yeah, so there's loads. So I mean, we did. I think we briefed 400 civil servants altogether, as well as lots and lots of stakeholder groups. I mean, there's well over 1,000 people I think came along to individual briefings. There's been quite a lot of media interest as well, and lots of interest from other countries and different parts of the UK as well that want to run similar processes. The one in Scotland is now underway, which is great, although obviously it has to be online, but that's all happening. The thing that I'm really interested in, and this is what I'm working on directly now, is how it relates back to what we were just talking about, how you actually make this kind of deliberation much more normal in policymaking. So, if you're at all close to government, you'll know the kind of hideous process that is the 6-week consultation. So government isn't allowed to do anything without consulting. And that means, putting out a really tedious consultation document and giving people 6 weeks to reply. Well, the people who throw themselves into that are essentially the ones who have an interest in it. So, it will be the trade associations. For climate, it'll probably be the big environment groups, and that's good, thank goodness for them. But it's a really sterile process. So I'm actually looking at ways that you can build that kind of deliberative approach and build citizen engagement into the sort of everyday policymaking process. So that's another sort of indirect spin-off from Climate Assembly UK.
And one quick question I have as well is just this idea of legitimacy. I mean, have you had conversations with people who weren't involved in the Climate Assembly on what they thought about it? Because this is one of the things is, when you have these citizens' juries, do people identify with them? And is that something we can encourage?
Yeah, so I think one difference between the French Assembly and the UK one is that the French Assembly, partly because it was very much President Macron's baby, actually managed much better to reach out to French society more widely. More people knew about it. It was more sort of topic of conversation than it has been here. I think more of that could have been done here, but there's very good evidence to show that people who haven't been part of a process trust the process if it's explained to them, because they trust people like them to have made good decisions. It's the same way that we trust jury trials. If you can say this decision was, or this recommendation was made by a group of people like you or like the country as a whole, then there tends to be acceptance and support for that decision. And that's very different from saying you should do this because the experts tell you to.
I mean, speaking of that, there always has to be a question about COVID. But your book sort of details about how when you have these challenges, which can be viewed as quite scientific or technical, it's so important to have them being part of a broader dialogue so that you get political buy-in from people. In the UK's response to the pandemic, we've seen a lot of rhetoric of following the science. We've seen science communication, good and bad, taking place. It is, of course, a different challenge to climate change, although people draw parallels. I wonder what you made of those parallels between the response to the pandemic and climate change, and what has maybe stood out to you from our response as someone who thinks about how democracies handle these scientific crises.
The following the science thing is political cover. That's all it is. I mean, and COVID and climate are the same from that point of view, in that you absolutely want really good scientific evidence. You really need that. You need that about the nature of the problem, what the virus is and how it's transmitted, as well as obviously climate in terms of the nature of the climate problem. You also need really good evidence about the possible options for responses. But, at the end of the day, it's a political decision that our leaders have to take on our behalf. And so, I would say two things. Firstly, I would say that politicians have to face up to that. They have to carry the can, and they can't hide behind the science. And the second thing I'd say is that they should involve citizens in those decisions. So, I think it's really bad on COVID that we haven't had the sort of underlying rationale for, the different tier systems, or, when lockdowns introduced or whatever. It's all quite opaque how those decisions are reached. There isn't a lot of citizen participation in those decisions, and it's obviously hard to get that if you're moving so quickly, but it's still quite possible. So I think there's a lot of I think COVID has been an example of how not to do things in terms of citizen participation, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. And it was hard at the beginning, but we've been doing this for almost a year now. You would have thought at some point, if people had this as a priority to get citizen engagement, they might have had a chance to do that. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's going to produce a lot of interesting work, people just looking back at this from all sorts of points of view. Obviously, I'm interested in science communication. You're interested in science policy. Me too. Just trying to figure out the lessons that we can learn from this is going to be some quite substantial work there as well. In terms of framings of the climate change problem, then, I wanted to ask about, because you talk in the book about this this idea of a spaceship Earth, and global climate targets set by Paris, concepts of a global carbon budget, ideas of planetary boundaries that we have to stay within. And if you could talk a little bit about our sort of attempts to be pilots of Spaceship Earth. I think it's really interesting that we have the UN and multilateral institutions, the UNFCCC and global climate negotiations. And they seem to have moved towards almost a more citizens' assembly type approach, as opposed to the top-down technocratic approach, right? Because initially we had the Kyoto Protocol, now we've moved to Paris, where, okay, it's still at the level of national governments, but it more relies on bottom-up contributions, countries setting their own targets, and there's a bit more of a discursive nature to how those targets evolve. Do you think that the Paris Agreement itself is kind of a reflection of this less top-down and more bottom-up style of government philosophy? And what are your thoughts on that in the international sphere?
Yeah, so in the international sphere, I think Copenhagen represented the kind of high watermark, or should that be lowest ebb? Hang on, where am I going with my water metaphors here? I think Copenhagen showed the limitations of that kind of top-down, science-led, expert-led, target-led approach. And I don't for a moment want to say it's not important to have the kind of scientific consensus that you have in the IPCC. I don't for a moment want to say that you shouldn't be having international negotiations. They are absolutely essential. But I think that kind of spaceship Earth vision is based on a fundamentally wrong assumption that it's possible to govern the planet the way that you might fly a spaceship, that there is some kind of privileged position from which you can look down and decide on the best course of action for the planet as a whole. I mean, I find that a really problematic view. So this is less a criticism of the international negotiations than it is a criticism of the sort of planetary boundaries type philosophy that, we as men in white coats, and they are mostly men, have decided what's best for the rest of you, and can you now please implement it? And, I mean, that's exaggeration, but not that much. I mean, I find that ethically really problematic. It's also just so at odds with how power and politics works. Democracies operate at the nation state level and no higher. Decisions are made best. Better decisions are made if people who are affected by those decisions are involved in making them. These are pretty uncontroversial truths, which are ignored by those sorts of spaceship Earth visions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess a spaceship is inherently anti-democratic, isn't it? Because Captain Kirk gets to fly it, and you sort of all have to do what he says.
Yeah.
There's not actually that. Maybe the crew gets to complain occasionally, but unless they're going to mutiny, they don't really have an option to fly things in a different direction. I mean, so do you think that sort of, we talked about Copenhagen and the failure of to get a global treaty there. Do you think that the Paris Agreement is looking more successful than those earlier approaches?
I think it's a more realistic negotiating mechanism. The idea that each country should put forward its own nationally determined contribution rather than being set a target from the sort of UN from the top down, from the negotiating process. I think that makes a lot more sense. But it does throw the responsibility onto individual countries. And, actually, at the moment, it's not working, is it? I mean, if you add up the Paris pledges, they still take us to definitely above 2 and somewhere approaching 3 degrees, I think. There needs to be a lot more ambition coming from somewhere. But I think that we've seen huge increases in ambition over the past couple of years. You see all the countries now with net zero targets. You see what's happened in the US. You see that, in this country, we have possibly the most progressive right-wing government on climate that definitely we've ever had, and maybe the world's ever had. And, obviously I have plenty of criticisms of this government, believe me, mostly involving coal mines. But, I do have criticisms of this government. But at the same time, it is, better than any of its predecessors. So I suppose that, we'll all be on absolute tenterhooks over the coming months to see whether some of this ambition in the form of targets and rhetoric filters down. I mean, it has to, doesn't it? Because what other option have we got?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a few things in your book that I wanted to talk about as well. In your descriptions of approaches to climate politics, which maybe aren't so successful. And one of them was the description of the feelgood fallacy in the approach that we often take to climate change, which I think we can all be guilty of. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the feel-good fallacy is basically when you concentrate on all the good stuff and you sort of tuck away the all those huge sources of greenhouse gas emissions that are just too difficult or messy or embarrassing to talk about. Every country does it. Every company does it, and to a certain extent we're all guilty of that as individuals, aren't we? Sometimes we do that without thinking. So, as individuals, in being relatively rich people in one of the richest countries of the world, we just have sort of structurally we are high emitters, and we need to face up to that. A feel-good fallacy is if you you're really pleased with the efforts you've made to reduce your footprint without acknowledging that yours is vast compared to someone from the global south. But what really annoys me is when the feel-good fallacy is used very deliberately and very cynically to justify the actions of real serious carbon polluters. So, in the Cumbria coal mine, their argument is that it's okay to dig more coal out of the ground because it would reduce emissions from transporting coal into the UK from elsewhere. I mean, that is just, it's disingenuous, it's wrong, disingenuous, and it just shouldn't be allowed. Similarly, I saw recently an advert by Bristol Airport where they pointed out all the carbon that could be saved by people flying from their local airport rather than driving to London. And again, I mean, in factual terms, that is dubious, but also it's just so disingenuous, and it's promoting one of the highest carbon industries there is, and it's the highest carbon industry that is used by the richest people, taking up carbon that cannot then be emitted by some of the world's poorest people, and that to my mind is outrageous, and we really need to call companies out on that.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And the other side of this feel-good fallacy is also what you describe as the stealth strategy. So the feel-good fallacy is saying, don't worry, everything that we do to address climate change is brilliant. Look at all these improvements we're making. Look at all of the wonderful things we can do as part of the problem. And then in the stealth strategy, it's more about we can address climate change in ways that people won't notice. And it has some interesting links to kind of, I guess you might call them techno-utopian solutions to climate change as well, where, all we need to do is kind of do this technical fix behind the scenes. And I feel like there's a really big split in the climate movement at the moment between people who I think they're more reformists, maybe, they're maybe more optimistic about technology, and they think that this is going to be you just switch the fuel source and that will fix the problem. And then there's another group of people who think, well, no, what this actually requires is a much deeper rethink of how we run society. And I wondered whether you'd like to talk about stealth strategies and also maybe where you find yourself on that spectrum between those two groups of people, assuming you agree with that as a distinction that you can make in the climate movement as well.
Yeah, I think the temptation to sort of, what you might call a stealth strategy, or the temptation to sort of tidy things away by saying that technology will solve it. I think if anything, it's become part of the discourse more as the climate movement has widened and you see people coming in. So, with Elon Musk and Bill Gates and so on sort of now piling into the climate space. I mean, great that they are, I'll welcome pretty much anyone. But the tendency of those players to focus on, technological solutions and at the very extreme, the kind of carbon removal, like carbon capture and storage or direct air capture, technologies which I think are, technologies which are unproven and not commercial. And so as a result, I think are a big distraction from the central issue. So I think that there is more, I think you're right that there's more of a gap now opening up between the sort of extreme techno-optimists at one end and then the sort of the other, I don't want to say other extreme, the sort of directly opposed argument, which says that the fundamental issue is our economic systems. And that, unless we, it's a crude way of putting it, but unless we abolish capitalism, we won't solve climate change. And I think, I think where I come from this is that I can see the attraction of moving to either extreme because it's simple, isn't it? It's like saying abolish capitalism or do solar radiation management, job done. And actually where I want to start and where I think that we should be resolutely focused is, what is the nature of the problem today? What do we do today, next month, next year, assuming that these kind of big fixes aren't going to come and save us? And, there's a philosopher called Donna Haraway, who I quote in my book, who's turgid and virtually unreadable, but she has this phrase, staying with the trouble, which is really, which really spoke to me, because the point of what I take from that phrase, staying with the trouble, is that we have to absolutely faithfully keep coming back to what the climate problem is, what causes it. It's the way our economy works, it's burning fossil fuels. We have to be, with every sort of solution we propose, we have to say, is this staying with the trouble? Is this helping things in this moment? Or is it just sort of, is it a distraction? And I think if the more purist you are to either extreme, the less likely you are to be able to sort of stay with the trouble in all its messiness and complexity.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really, really important perspective, because I think you're right to say that it can be very simple to view this as something where there is going to be one panacea solution. And one of the lines of argument that I think is so important there is just to sort of remember that actually we invent a technology and instantly get our way out of this situation is sort of in some ways maybe as unrealistic as we instantly transform the global geopolitical system, when there's no mechanism to do that or theory of change to do that in the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say about those two, either the capitalism thing or the technology will save us thing, I think it's fine to hold those views as long as you also have a view for what you would do, what you're going to do today and tomorrow and next month. So, if you don't agree with the capitalist economic system, then that's okay. But you also need to be doing stuff that works towards that, your goal, and that makes things better in the short and medium term. Same with the big tech breakthroughs. Fine if you want to put your faith in those, but not if that's at the expense of using tried and tested technologies today.
Yeah. So it's kind of, I don't know, have your aspirational goals and hope for the best, but also prepare for reality as it exists and try and deal with what's going on now as well.
Yeah, think of it.
There's room for both.
Yeah, think of it as, if you think of it as an approach to healthcare, for example, we'd never get away with that in healthcare, would we? Like, oh no, we're not going to invest in, in sort of short to medium term public health and health facilities, because there's going to be a wonder drug tomorrow which will make us all healthy and live for eternity. That wouldn't wash. And the opposite of, oh, we're all going to be really unhealthy until we reform capitalism or abolish capitalism, that wouldn't be an answer either. I think with issues that are sort of much more central to our everyday lives, like education or health, we don't we're not allowed to get away with that sort of wishful thinking.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. There was one thing that you talked about in the last chapter of your book as well, which was discussing things from the other side. And it feeds into what we're talking about here, which is for those of us who want to influence existing institutions, systems, politicians, and so on, and that there's this difficulty and maybe this tension between being a pragmatic influencer who tries to shape and influence things as they are versus a radical influencer who sort of sits on the outside of a system and says, now we need to tear this down, we need to do things completely differently. And in some ways, you can see that maybe some of the people who are on the techno-optimistic side are a bit like the pragmatic influencers, and maybe some of the people who are more on, I guess you'd call it the eco-socialist side, for want of a better term, would be radical influencers. Would you like to talk about maybe some examples of the differences between these approaches and whether there's room for both of them as well?
Yeah, there's absolutely room for both of them. So you always need people to and organisations who can be absolutely uncompromising. The Greenpeace style, scaling the oil rigs, the Greta Thunberg style. Absolutely, this is the problem. Relentlessly focused on that. And then you also need those organisations who can work the inside track and who can convert that kind of political pressure into what does this politician do today or tomorrow? So it's a really complex ecosystem like that. And I think when it works best is when all sides recognise and support the roles that each other plays. I think when it comes unstuck is when, what I've seen is when the kind of inside influencer route, when you get too wound up in the means and you lose sight of the ends. So I think that some aspects of, some climate actors have been guilty of this, that they're so happy with whatever sort of marginal changes they manage to get through, that they lose sight of the big picture, which is that we need really ambitious action really quickly. And so I think what we've seen in the past couple of years with the school strikes, Extinction Rebellion and so on, is a bit of a reset about what the big question is. And I think that now's the time for even those whose methods might be very sort of softly, still need quite I hesitate to say radical because it's not radical. It's just what's needed.
Realistic.
Yeah, a realistically radical account of what needs to happen. So, you know, I think that that if you are taking the inside track, you need to be asking yourself that question all the time.
Because it's a balancing act for everyone, even if you're on the outside track as well, thinking, okay, well, if I'm just howling into an echo chamber of people who agree with me and not actually influencing what's going on, that's also a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And you know, that's more of a problem with social media, isn't it? I mean, you know, you got to love climate Twitter, but I spend a lot of time chatting to people who agree with me. I think that, you know, I think when if you're talking about the more sort of protesting, campaigning end of the climate movement, I think the challenge for them is to reach out. It's like, you know, going back to our earlier conversation, what's happened so well in the US is the climate movement joining forces with people calling for social justice and racial justice. They've made those really strong alliances. You can see similar alliances that need to be built on the right, and it's a, you know, slightly different picture in the UK. But I think that the challenge to take that message and to work with other groups and other constituencies is really where we need to be now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so we've touched on it a bit. The protest movements that came out in 2019, especially Greta Thunberg, Fridays for Future, the Sunrise Movement in the US, the push on the left there for a Green New Deal, Extinction Rebellion here in the UK and elsewhere. And I think it has brought climate change to the top of the agenda in a way that I personally don't feel like I remember it being. Maybe the closest thing we got was in 2007-8 when the Climate Change Act was being passed, which was when I first started paying attention to this stuff, when it was on the news. It feels like maybe we're approaching a tipping point for climate action and climate change getting into the political sphere. And then in 2020 and now into 21, we've seen lots of nations and organizations, as you've said, set climate change goals and targets as part of this 5-year anniversary of Paris and all this sort of thing. So we have China's net zero by 2060 we've talked about here. We've talked about the UK's targets, Biden's goal, which we're going to talk about in the future, and so on. And we're maybe getting closer to that realm where if everyone does do what they say they're going to do, we have a shot at achieving the Paris Agreement, which would be an amazing thing. But having these long-term targets in place, you know, you have a 10-point plan in your book that any good climate policy must answer. And actually having the long-term target in place is just the first on the list of things that people need to do. So once we have these targets in place, assuming that is happening now everywhere, what else do we have to ensure? What do we need to do to keep this momentum going beyond just getting things, you know, getting a target declared and then everything kind of dissipating and ending up with a gap between rhetoric and action? Because you have so many great ideas there. I'd really love you to talk about them for the audience.
Yeah, so I mean, you really need a target, don't you? Because you need to know where you're headed, but you also need really vocal political leadership, and you know, that has been lacking. We might be seeing it from Biden now. We're seeing it actually to a certain extent from Boris Johnson in terms of his repetition of the target, but not in terms of implementing that in his sort of vision for the country at all. You need citizens to be part of that conversation. You know, you need this to be a two-way street between citizens and state. And then you just need it to be a genuine plan. So, you know, it needs to be internally consistent. You just can't be credible as a country heading for a net zero economy if you are also economically dependent on fossil fuels, unless you have a really clear plan about how you're getting out of them. So I mean, the idea. I mean, I just use the coal mine because it's such a good example. But the idea that you can claim to lead the way on climate change and then consent a project that gets 9 million tons a year of carbon out of the ground is just ridiculous. I mean, there's really good evidence to show that we cannot invest in any more fossil fuel extraction infrastructure or high carbon infrastructure. So we can't have any more oil or gas wells, coal mines, or airports consented anywhere in the world if we're going to meet Paris targets. That's not my opinion. That is, it's pretty very solid economists doing the maths. So it has to be consistent from that point of view, and it can't be offshored to other countries. And these things that citizens understand. Well, in the Climate Assembly, there was quite a lot of when the citizens developed their own recommendations. They actually pointed out themselves that emissions shouldn't be offshored, and it was one of their additional recommendations that they made without any prompting from anyone. So they understand that. They understand the craziness of that double counting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think it's important because we talk about the idea that near-term targets are also needed, as well as in the UK we have net zero by 2050. When it comes to the short-termism issue, there's always a concern that the current government knows it won't be around in 2050. So we need a shorter-term target for perhaps 2030, when there might be political consequences for the actors who are still there at the moment if it's not met. And also the plan has to be distributed across the different parts of the government and the different sectors as well, so that everyone is doing something that ultimately just adds up. I mean, we talked about internationally trying to get the pledges to add up to Paris, and nationally you need what each part of your economy is doing to add up to your own national target as well.
Yeah. And when the Climate Change Act was introduced back in 2009, there was an attempt to then get each individual government department to have its own carbon target, and also the idea of carbon targets for local authorities, for local areas, was discussed as well. So the idea was that you'd have the nationwide target, but that would be cascaded to across different sectors and regions. And that never happened because there was a change of government, and it was all Ed Miliband's thinking, and he was kicked out. But you need that accountability, don't you? You can't you can't just say I support this target, but could someone else please do the work? It's got to be shared, and it's got to be shared as well, so that people see the opportunities, and so that when you're developing a local economic strategy, that you are thinking about that in terms of the move to net zero, that you're not investing in industries that have no future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And some of the other recommendations you make that I just want to go through, because I think it's really important that people get all of this, although of course they should read your book as well for much more detail on this stuff. But the idea that, you've got the target, but to back that up, you also need someone who's going to independently measure what you're doing, scrutinize your policy things to see if they're actually making sense and are going to deliver on what you say they will, and verifying that it's actually taking place in the first place. In the UK, we have the Committee on Climate Change, which is sort of tasked to do that. And obviously there should be other areas of oversight as well. I wondered if you feel like that's a good model for other countries to follow, and whether there are other examples of what of what this is doing at the moment in terms of getting that independent measurement and assurance that the plans that are being proposed actually do add up to what they say that they are supposed to do.
Yeah, so I think the Climate Change Committee is a really good model, and that was, as you'll know, that was set up as part of the Climate Change Act, and it's really important to have that independent measurement. And I think it's something, talking to Chris Stark, who runs the CCC, they get requests all the time for conversations with them about how that could work in other countries, and I think there are similar institutions in other countries. So that's a really, really good model. I mean, it's only as good as the government wants it to be. So in the UK, for the past, I think it must be at least 5 years, if not longer, every year the Climate Change Committee has sort of quite politely pointed out what they call the policy gap, which is the gap between the policies that government has actually committed to and invested in and legislated for, compared to they've added up whether or not they meet the targets, the interim targets, and they don't. So they've pointed out this policy gap time and time again. It gets to be a problem for an organisation like the CCC if they keep pointing that out and government doesn't start making up the difference, doesn't address that gap. Because, I mean, what can they do? They can they take the government to court? Can they? I mean, actually, you can. The targets are legally binding, so presumably someone could do a judicial review of the government on that basis and force it to change its mind. But it becomes very murky. What happens if a government doesn't follow the advice of its own independent advisors?
I mean, some of the other points you made that I thought were important too is, and I mean, the coal mine being a perfect example of this, you can't just have the sunny side, the happiness, the feel-good fallacy taking place. You actually need to work on the supply side as well and say, okay, if you're going to be compatible with climate change targets, we can't have any more fossil fuel exploration and extraction, and eventually we have to phase out it being used as well. And that links into the next point, which is the idea of this just transition, and that governments, if they're going to have democratic legitimacy to do this, and if it's going to fit with other things that they want to do, they need to think about how it impacts different local areas and jobs and the kind of distributional consequences of the plan as well. I mean, are these things that are being looked at in the UK seriously? And do you have any thoughts on maybe how that could be improved?
I mean, I have so many thoughts on how it could be improved. It's kind of like everything I do.
Yeah.
But
sorry,
I would say that the biggest difficulty with this government's approach at the moment is that they treat climate as a sort of separate sphere. So, they will, whenever asked about it, will pledge allegiance to net zero and reel off a list of things that they are doing to meet it. And meanwhile, all the other priorities of the government sort of trundle on unchanged. So you can see that in when they were talking about the economic recovery plan from COVID. I think they were, very pleased that they'd set aside, I think off the top of my head, it was £2 billion for green recovery. Well, that's just missing the point entirely. It should just be all recovery is green recovery. That's what's going to need to happen if we're going to meet the net zero targets. That's what the Climate Assembly was strongly in favour of, actually. So they can't anymore separate out climate from the rest of their agenda. So they're going to, it comes back to what we were saying about having a really clear political story to tell and a way of building climate into their political strategy and economic strategy.
Yes, and just having it integrated with everything else that's going on, so that people don't really view it so much as a nice extra or a sort of additional thing that you do on top of everything else that you're doing, but it has to really be the climate implications of everything that you do needs to be thought out and needs to be compatible with the plan. I think that's very important, and it's going to be, in many ways, the momentum and the targets being set and the ambition and the fact that it's back in the political sphere is all very exciting for those of us who are concerned about it. But the hard work of actually doing it to a much greater extent in these different sectors kind of starts here. And I think that's where maintaining this democratic engagement and legitimacy is just so important, which is why your work is also very, very important. So I wanted to sort of round off by saying to everyone that if you want much, much more insight into these issues and how democracies have tried to handle climate change and how they have failed and succeeded in that and how they should change in the future, then Too Hot to Handle is a really, really excellent reference on that. And the like many of these books, it doesn't just pose the problem; it comes up with solutions at the end, which is a really, really good thing. I just wanted to ask before we sign off if there was anything else that you would like to recommend people read or get involved with, or if they want to find out more about your work, what they can do.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of things to read, I would really recommend the opening statement of the Climate Assembly. It's less than a page, and it really sets it out. So that's a good one. In terms of following me, I'm on Twitter far more than I should be. That's at Bankfield Becky, and I quite often blog for Green Alliance as well. So plenty of ways to follow. And thanks very much for having me on.
That you're very, very welcome. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and talking to us about the democratic challenge of climate change, which is a challenge I hope we can all get together and solve over the rest of our lives. Thank you very, very much for your time today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Physical Attraction, and thanks again to Professor Willis for being so generous with her time. You can find Too Hot to Handle, her book, through Bristol University Press and online, and the Professor links to her research on Twitter at Bankfield Becky. I was a little under the weather for this interview, so I apologise if it was a bit rambly. But the good news is that Professor Willis was also recently interviewed on a new environment and sustainability podcast, which is called the Rising with the Tide podcast. Now, Rising with the Tide podcast, they're interviewing loads of climate change and sustainability experts. They're super on the ball with these things. I mean, they're often interviewing guests that I talk about or plan on interviewing too. So if you want more of this sort of content, then I really do recommend them, and please do give that a listen. You can find the Rising with the Tide podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. As for our show, you can find us on physicspodcast.com. There you'll find the contact form if you have any comments, questions or concerns about the show, any topics that you'd like to hear about. While I'm covering climate change, I really want anyone's questions that they have about this topic to be answered. So please do get in touch there if there's anything that you would like to know. Also on the website you'll find our episode archive. We're nearing on 200 episodes now. I mean, it's kind of amazing when I think about it how long this has been going. And that means that there's plenty of different content across all sorts of different topics. From our news episodes in thermonuclear takes, to the birth of stars, to the end of the world, as we like to say, the climate episodes, and dozens of other interviews that you can listen to. So please do go and check through the archive there. Find an episode, and hey, one thing you can do to help out always is to tell your friends who might be interested in listening to this show to give it a listen, give it a chance, send them an episode they might be interested in, and see what they think. Other ways, of course, to support the show include the Patreon. Now, the Patreon is still going with many of the early release episodes of shows that will come out on the main feed later, and also some special bonus episodes that you can only get there. So it's a good thing to subscribe to if you want some more content from me. Now, you can find that on patreon.com/physicalattraction. And the subscription can be any value of currency that you like, and essentially gives you access to probably about 20 early release episodes, so most of the episodes that will come out this year instantly, and many of the episodes that I'm editing, as listeners will know who've listened to them already, because they've got them there, they come out on the Patreon first. So if you want to get hold of stuff, you can do it there. And you can also get in touch with us on Twitter, the hell site that is Twitter. We're there at PhysicsPod. Take a look there if you want to see a combination of me tweeting about the stuff that I cover on this show, and just occasionally things that have absolutely nothing to do with it. Until next time then, please do take care.